Hey there, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Varun Sriram with UCAN and thrilled to be joined by sports dietitian Bob Seebohar for a great chat today on metabolic efficiency training for trail running. Hey, Bob, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks so much for allowing this opportunity to share some knowledge with the trail runners.
Awesome, Bob. We're really excited for you to share your wisdom with us. Metabolic efficiency training is something you've been at the forefront of. It's a really cutting edge nutrition concept. So, really excited to have you bring your expertise and knowledge to the audience of trail runners today. Thanks again for being with us.
All right, fantastic. Thank you.
So, Bob, before we dive into the meat of this, tell us a little bit about who you are. What brings you to the sports world and the endurance world, and where did the passion for nutrition come from?
Yeah, I'll keep this as brief as possible because I know everyone wants to get into the nutrition. But I'm a competitive athlete. I have been since growing up, and I actually played soccer in my younger life, and got introduced to endurance sports halfway through my undergrad in college, and didn't really take up running per se until I dabbled in some Ironman races, a lot of triathlons, and then I always say I got a little bored in the Ironman world, and I actually moved on to the ultra trail running, ultra marathoning, and I tell you what, I really learned a lot about my body, about physiology. But I went through school and I studied exercise physiology, sport nutrition. Obviously, I'm a sport dietitian and a coach, so what I like to do is I really like to answer the questions that a lot of individuals, a lot of trail runners have is, what do I do? How do I do it? Why do I do this? But I kind of come at it from more of a scientific and real life. So a lot of times you'll talk to friends or running partners and they'll say, oh yeah, this is what I do and it works for me. And then sometimes you talk to these higher ups, these professors, and they say, well, this is what the research brings. So I kind of like to pride myself on kind of mixing the two because we want to get the best of both worlds. I still am an active ultra runner, so I do practice what I preach and consistently try different strategies in terms of fueling, in terms of hydration. So, I've got the education you can see on the screen. I've been very, very honored to work in some very prestigious places in terms of being a sport dietitian. But nowadays I love bringing the science and that gap of science into real life and actually giving the truth instead of a lot of this floating around information that may or may not be applicable. You're not quite sure what you're going to get. So that's kind of leads me to here. I've been doing endurance sports since 1993, and I've never looked back. I seem to do something different every year. I like to challenge myself, but fortunately, it's funny. It usually includes some type of ultra running. So that's where I'm at now.
And Bob, you mentioned kind of blending that scientific knowledge with real life experience, and frankly, that's exactly what we're going to do on this session here today. So, Bob, you're going to take us through the theory behind metabolic efficiency training, the science behind us, explain to all of us what it actually is and why it works, and then we're going to hear about your personal experience, kind of putting this philosophy into action this past fall when you were out at the Grand Canyon doing the rim to rim to rim run, which is an ultra run on trail. So really, your experience there feeds very nicely into the topic of conversation for today.
Absolutely, it's perfect, and I think it's important for everyone to realize a little bit of the science background because metabolic efficiency training, as we'll get into, it's not a fluff concept. It's nothing made up. It's been created from very, very hardcore science, and I've brought that alive and kind of put it into the real life setting that your ultra runner, your trail runner can understand very easily. So I'm super excited to share both the benefits of both worlds here.
So let's dive right into it, Bob. Take us
Yeah.
through this journey and help us understand what is metabolic efficiency training.
Yeah, so what you see on the slide here is it's kind of my intro slide that I always present here. And the first thing, if you go to the very bottom, I think it's very important for people to understand that sport nutrition is really a combination of looking at your daily nutrition, so your meals and your snacks, in addition to training nutrition. And that's basically what you put in your body right before you go out and run, while you're on the trails, and then what you do right after your run or your competitive event. So sport nutrition is that balance. It's not one or the other. So, good sport dietitians really work with ultra runners and trail runners, and we look at the combination of that. So once we have the combination of that, then we look at my nice fancy graph there, and on the bottom of that is this concept that I also created called nutrition periodization. And in brief, we're not going to get too much into this, but in brief, a nutrition periodization basically describes your daily nutrition supporting your training goals. So as an example, if you're in base training, you're just starting to hit the trails, you're trying to work on some easy miles, your daily nutrition should support that. You don't necessarily need to throw a lot of sugar in your body. You don't need to have like all these calories. But maybe as if you're training for a 50 or 100, as the mileage gets up and you start breaking down your body and beating it up a little bit more, maybe we need to start looking at nutrition a little differently and feeding your body different nutrients. So nutrition periodization basically is looking at the ebbs and flows of your training volume and your training intensity in relation to how nutrition, your daily nutrition specifically, supports that. So that's kind of the foundation. Where we really get into the fun stuff and what we're really going to focus on today is a term called metabolic efficiency training. And I'm going to get in a lot more detail here, but just let me give you the 30,000-foot view here. Metabolic efficiency training, as you can see, is really about improving the body's efficiency in using carbohydrate and fat. Now, we store carbohydrate and fat in our body, right? Metabolic efficiency training isn't a diet. It's not a low carb, high fat. It's not keto. It's not high carb, low fat. It's not paleo. It's not any of these things, right? Metabolic efficiency training is a lifestyle program. And I know that sounds funny, but really lifestyle program that allows you to adapt your nutrition to your training goals, right? So back to this thing, it's not a diet, right? It's made up predominantly of 75% nutrition. So throughout this journey and this story, as you listen to me, you're going to realize that when you can improve your body's ability to utilize its stored fat and carbohydrates, you can actually go longer, fewer calories, recover faster, decreased inflammation. It's fantastic, right? But you don't necessarily have to do it all from aerobic training. So a lot of times ultra runners, we head out, keep pretty low heart rates depending on the terrain that you're doing, and that will actually aid in improving your body's ability to adapt or to burn fat. However, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of this really has to do with changing your nutrition. So a lot of times when I work with ultra runners and trail runners, I don't really adapt their training much. I really come into the equation in terms of nutrition. So please take from this that nutrition is far more important at adapting your body from a metabolic efficiency standpoint than is exercise. Now, that said, back to this whole storing carb and fat. So the average ultra runner probably stores around 1,400 to 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrates, depending on gender and depending on size, right? So obviously smaller female ultra runners, trail runners will store fewer carbohydrate. Larger male runners will store more carbohydrate. Now, that's fine. It's all great. That's only going to give you about 2, maybe 3 hours of energy reserves when you're out on the trails, depending on the intensity that you do, right? So now contrast this to the amount of fat that you store in your body. So you store around, depending on body composition, you store about 50,000 up to 80,000 calories as fat. So obviously there's a huge, I look at it at potential, right? A lot of people don't look at it that way, but we store a whole bunch of fat. If we can just teach our body to tap into those fat reserves, for the trail runner, for the ultra runner, this is just gold. I cannot describe it any more eloquently, because you can now go for 4, 5, 6 hours at a time without much feeding, to be honest with you. And you'll hear my personal example a little bit later. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to teach our body to burn more fat and store more carbohydrates when we really need them. Now, when do trail runners need them? What do ultra runners, how are we different than the average endurance athlete, cyclist, triathlete, whatever? Well, typically we are going to go out for longer duration. Typically our intensity is not going to be too high, again, depending on the trails that you're hitting, but there's always some downhills, there's always some flats. So usually our intensity level isn't as aggressive as if we were going to drop into a 5 or a 10K, right? So that's a huge opportunity for us, because now we're actually able to improve our exercise capacity to burn fat, but we combine that with a great, daily nutrition and training nutrition plan to actually augment and even support fat adaptation or fat burning even more. So that's kind of the overall picture of metabolic efficiency training.
So Bob, so efficiency, that word, even as somebody that's running distance, is so appealing, right? It's you can kind of understand that if you're efficient, your body's going to be more optimized to do that. But what is the converse of that? What does being metabolically inefficient look like? How would I know as a trail runner if I wasn't metabolically efficient?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, the first thing when you're out on the trails, the last thing you want to do is carry a lot of calories, right? That's just added weight. It's added stress on your musculoskeletal system. We do not, as trail runners, we do not want to have a lot of weight on our body. So, being inefficient, and you can see this from the slide. Obviously, if you're not efficient at utilizing your fat stores, that means you're going to be relying more on your carbohydrate stores. So, just like I said, you have fat and carbohydrate stores, and you're either going to burn one and store the other, or store one and burn the other, right? So it's kind of a dichotomy here. So if you're relying more on carbohydrate stores, of which you don't have that many, you're going to need to supplement with more carbohydrates. So you've got to take more food with you. You've got to take more sport nutrition products with you. That's extra weight. That's extra space, if you even have space in a pack, right? So it actually produces a very, very poor tactical decision in terms of needing calories, right? So you have a higher risk of GI distress. You could increase your body weight and body fat throughout training because you're probably overfeeding. And then in some cases, in terms of health, not necessarily performance, but the more sugar and the more calories that you eat, especially from sugar-rich products, the more you will be predisposed for some disease states. So it's really important if you can teach your body to become more efficient, you actually store your carbohydrates better. You don't need to carry as many calories, and really you can burn mostly on the fuel that your body really loves to burn, and that's fat.
You said this before, Bob, but I think it's worth mentioning again for the average person. We always tend to think about, or distance running as being such a carbohydrate dominant and carbohydrate dependent activity. But as you've been outlining for us, can you just one more time highlight the amount of stored carbohydrate versus the amount of stored fat in an individual?
Absolutely. So the average person will store between 1,400 and 2,000 calories of carbohydrate, and that will give you about 2 to 3 hours worth of energy if you're training. Now, there are a lot of ifs actually. If you're training at a moderate intensity, so that's what we usually refer to as aerobic or zone 1, zone 2, basically, right? So up to 2,000 calories, 2 to 3 hours worth of energy. Contrast that to 50 to 80,000 calories stored as fat, and you could literally probably do a few 100-mile races on the amount of fat that you have stored in your body. It doesn't mean you're not going to be eating, which we'll get to a little bit later, but it just means that your reliance upon supplemental calories will be so reduced because you are now so actively burning through those 50 to 80,000 calories, but it's going to take a really long time to burn through those fat calories than it would carbohydrate calories.
Now, one thing to consider, and it's never all or nothing, right? When we talk about fat burning or carbohydrate burning, there's always
Right.
a mix of the two. So how can we understand that relationship and kind of think about the mix of fuels that we're burning and kind of the impact that has?
Absolutely. It's a great point. So your body has, like I said, stored carbohydrates, stored fat. You're almost every point in time, your body is burning both nutrients, fat and carbohydrate. You can see this from this graph that I show up here. This is the traditional, what's called crossover concept in exercise physiology. And all we're looking at here is the red line is the percentage of fat being burned. The blue line is percentage of carbohydrate being burned. And all this graph is saying is basically this: low intensity exercise, we burn more fat. Higher intensity exercise, we burn more carbohydrate. Now, in the past, what we have seen from exercise physiology research, and this is why I highlighted this, in the past, where your body crosses, which was affectionately called the crossover point, that in research has been shown to be 63 to 65% of your max intensity, and that can be measured as VO2 or heart rate. what's important here is to look at that star and say, okay, everything to the left of that or under 65% max intensity, which for ultra runners is usually aerobic or zone 1, zone 2 training, you're burning more fat. That's all great. That's fine. Fantastic. However, there's an opportunity here to move that star to the right. And this is what I asked about 15, 16, 17 years ago when I started creating this concept. Is I challenged this and I said, well, is there an opportunity? We know we burn both macronutrients and we know we burn fat at low intensities, carbohydrate at higher intensities, but is there an opportunity to move this point? Like, can we develop better fat burning at higher intensities? And of course, the answer is yes, which I'll get to here in a second. But let's just introduce the who cares. Like, why is that important to burn more fat at higher intensities? Well, we kind of covered that. But if you can actually push this crossover, what I call the metabolic efficiency point, if you can push it to the right, what you're doing is you're now able to utilize fat higher intensity. So when you're climbing up a mountain, right, your heart rate's a little bit high, you're actually going to be burning more fat, which means, again, you need less carbohydrates from supplemental calories. You don't need to carry as many carbohydrates because you're running mostly on fat. And that is the huge, huge, huge importance of trying to shift your metabolic efficiency point.
Very interesting. And it's, it's kind of, I think, to a lot of people that have been in the sport that are listening to this for perhaps several years. I know, Bob, when I've heard you talk about this in person, this oftentimes is where minds start to get blown. So I want to have you keep taking us through this journey.
Yes, absolutely. So, and let me just stop and pause really quick. This isn't, like I said earlier, metabolic efficiency training is not a diet. Metabolic efficiency training is the combination of using nutrition and exercise. And remember what I said earlier, nutrition far outweighs the ability to become fat adapted than does exercise, but they're both important. And let me just say this, that this is grounded in scientific research, right? Everything, well, most of this that you'll see, you can study in exercise physiology research, biochemistry, nutritional, metabolism. Everything that I use to develop this metabolic efficiency training concept is based on scientific physiological nutrition research. So feel good about this. This isn't your whatever name of the game, trend diet or whatever that's out there. Like this actually has some clout. So introducing this graph, the combination of nutrition and exercise is very important. But here's what I've shown in my testing, and others have shown. And actually, there was some new research published a couple of years ago that basically describes what I was just talking about. You can move your metabolic efficiency point to the right, which is improving it, right? Unfortunately, I've also seen people destroy their metabolic efficiency point and move it to the left, which is not what ultra runners, trail runners want. Let me just say that. But what we're seeing here is, as we're now looking at a nutrition change, daily nutrition, training nutrition, once we bring in the factors of manipulating blood sugar and controlling and optimizing that, we can actually push that metabolic efficiency point up to 89% of VO2 max. And that wasn't even my lab that did this. This was research that has been published by another individual overseas in the UK. My personal research and testing with athletes is I've shown that I can push that metabolic efficiency point up to 87% VO2 max. Again, take home message is this: if you can burn fat at higher intensities, you are able to not only store and I'll say preserve carbohydrates for when you really need them, AKA usually climbs for ultra runners, but you are utilizing more economical fuel, so you don't have to carry as much. You don't need as many calories. I mean, when I share my story about the Grand Canyon rim to rim to rim, it's going to completely shock people how many calories per hour I consumed and what I consumed during that journey. And that's part of this. It's not, and let me just make this, it's not about how low you can go in terms of calories per hour. What's really matters is how economical you can make your body in terms of using fat and preserving carbohydrate.
And to that point, Bob, I think what's so fascinating, in talking to athletes that have employed this message and in hearing your experience is it's like I think it's exactly the point you were just making. This wouldn't be a strategy you would be utilizing to run rim to rim to rim if it was a starvation diet, or if it was something that was calorie restrictive and made you feel crummy. The whole kind of idea of this, and what makes it so powerful, I guess, for endurance athletes is the energy that you're able to maintain while you're following this nutrition philosophy, right? It's really like that's what's so powerful about it, is being able to kind of have this calorie control and be more efficient while also feeling great.
Yeah, absolutely. And the great thing is not only is energy stable, but it's not restrictive. There's no bad or good foods unless of course you're allergic to them, right? You don't have to play the diet mentality game anymore. And you're not starving yourself. You're not actually even counting calories, right? You're just actually getting a little bit more in tune with your body and feeling good, and giving it what it needs at the times that it needs it.
So you talked about the idea, Bob, that there was testing for this, and so take us through that. What is the testing all about, and how do we understand, through the testing, the power of metabolic efficiency and the impact it can have?
Absolutely. So back in the early 2000s, this is when I first came up with this and really devised metabolic efficiency training concept. And it took me about a year to 2 years to develop the physiological testing. But as a trained physiologist, also, I'm very privy to all exercise physiology tests. Went through school, VO2 max testing and spirometry and lactate threshold, everything, like you name it. So I kind of put my old college university hat on and actually developed the test to see to basically ask the question, how efficient am I at burning fat, or how efficient am I at burning carbohydrate? So I've created this test, and you can see this here. It's actually a very easy test. Fortunately or unfortunately, it does require a piece of technology called a metabolic cart, and you need to go to a performance center or someone that has a metabolic cart. If they have that technology, then they can do this test. Now, let me just say this, because I always get a lot of listeners, a lot of athletes and trail runners saying, well, wait a second, if I don't have access to this test, is this still okay? Like, is it still valid? Should I still do it? Absolutely. Remember what I just said? I created the concept before I created the testing. So I take athletes through this all the time without them needing, or without them having the ability to test. I will say this though, if you, anytime with biomarker testing or metabolic efficiency testing, if you have access to it, it just really shortens your learning curve. And as you'll see, and maybe if you're a little more analytical like I am, you like to geek out with numbers, you can really do a lot more with your dietary intervention if you know the numbers from a test. So let me just explain. What you see here on the graph is, it looks very similar to the graphs you just saw, except this is an actual male endurance athlete. This was actually an ultra runner. This was done a couple of years ago, April 4th, 2016. Red line is the percentage of fat that he's burning. Blue line is the percentage of carbohydrate that he's burning. And you see a very similar pattern. Not everybody looks like this. I just wanted to choose one that really looked pretty. Now what you see is every data point is a 4-minute data point, and every 4 minutes the intensity increases. So this particular athlete, I took him on, he was on a treadmill, and he started at an 8:27 minute per mile pace and went all the way down to a 6:19 minute per mile pace. And again, it's not a VO2 max test. Like, once I get the data, and you can see where that star is, or that metabolic efficiency point that I call it, once I have that, I don't need to really continue the test much longer. So it's not max VO2, it's actually a sub-maximal test. And we get a whole bunch of data from this. From this particular test for this athlete, we were able to tell him that his metabolic efficiency point, or the point where his fat burning started to become more reduced, and his carbohydrate burning was starting to become more improved or increased, happened at a heart rate of 155 beats per minute. His pace was a 6:31 minute per mile, and this was 87% of his VO2 peak, or VO2 max. So what we learn here is, I can actually, and I haven't given you a lot of pre and post, but what I can do is I can show you how your daily nutrition, so call it your breakfast, lunch, dinner, your snacks, I don't like to use the word diet, but let's just say your daily nutrition plan, I can show you quantitatively if that is actually working to your advantage in terms of improving your fat burning, or working to your disadvantage. simple test, takes anywhere between 20 to 40 minutes on a treadmill for ultra runners. Pretty easy. And for some ultra runners who are doing like super, super, super long races, I mean, I've worked with some who've done 250-mile races. A lot of times we can actually manipulate the treadmill to increase the grade also. So we can now get a little bit more specific to ultra runners. But basically what this is saying is we can use technology, as long as we know how to use technology, we can use it to benefit ultra endurance athletes and trail runners by manipulating the data to show whether or not their daily nutrition plan is supporting their goals or not supporting their goals.
So with that, Bob, so that's a great kind of distillation of what this data shows for the people that are listening here and might be thinking, maybe I'm not metabolically efficient. Of course, they haven't gotten tested. Perhaps they truly wouldn't know, but the slide you were talking through before, some of the characteristics of an inefficient runner, if those are ringing true with anybody in our audience, how do we go about starting to make this change? I think you said something a few minutes ago that was interesting, that I'm sure you'll get back to again, but this is a nutrition change, not an exercise change, and
Right.
or I should say percentage wise, it's more nutrition than exercise. And I think, in the endurance world, kind of historically, the type of training that slow and steady training has been what's been viewed to most impact fat burning. So as you get into the
Right.
nutrition side of things, what I wanted to ask you is, how did your mindset flip on that? Like how did you get to the place where you were saying, hey, it's got to be much more than the training. This nutrition component is a huge component of this. And then how do people start eating in a way to become more metabolically efficient?
Mm-hmm. Let me first set out by saying trail runners and ultra runners are, it's like metabolic efficiency and trail running is like a perfect marriage, right? Because the intensity is already lowered, because we're going longer, and we're actually backing off our pace a little bit more because, again, we are going longer. So it's like a match made in heaven, because I usually don't really need to manipulate the training for trail runners, because I know for the most part, they're keeping their intensity fairly low or lower, so they're able to utilize that 25% exercise contribution to fat burning. Now, that said, in terms of the nutrition component, so I just remember, again, almost decades ago now, working with ultra endurance runners, and a lot of the complaints were, I can't control my body weight, I'm gaining weight, body composition, I'm having GI distress. And I'm looking at their daily nutrition, and I just noticed a pattern, right? And the pattern was really carbohydrate dominance, and they were still training at lower intensities, and this is the power of it, right? They were still training in that zone 1, zone 2, that talking phase, if you will, but they weren't controlling their body weight. They weren't, controlling their GI distress, or they weren't managing that well. They were needing all these gels and sugar products every single hour, and they were complaining how they're going to carry it. So, I started scratching my head. I'm thinking, well, there's something going on here. And that's when I started the dietary protocols, if you will. So I started experimenting a lot with different carbohydrate strategies, protein, fat, and basically, what it really comes down to is, it comes down to, while everybody certainly is different, what it comes down to is controlling and optimizing blood sugar. So when we look at blood sugar, we know that if we can control it and optimize it, we can actually teach our body to use more fat. So let me explain it here with this slide with the nutrition roller coaster, right? And this is basic biochemistry. You can pick up a biochemistry textbook anywhere and read the same thing that I'm going to tell you. But if you eat a higher carbohydrate diet, call it, and I'm not picking on pasta, but call it bread or whatever, just starchy carbs, high refined sugar, carbohydrates, that's going to increase your body's burn rate of carbohydrates. It's a very cyclical cycle. So you eat carbs, you burn carbs, you eat carbs, you burn carbs. Remember before what I said, you don't store that many carbs. So you're actually, if you're in this cycle, you are going through your carbohydrate, your glycogen stores very, very quickly. And that's the runner that may not know this yet, and they're eating every 90 minutes to 2 hours. That's just, for most people, that's just not right, right? It's just not what we need from a health or performance standpoint. So if you look at the bottom of this slide, this up and down, this blue line, that signifies your blood sugar and your insulin curve, right? So when you wake up first thing in the morning, your blood sugar is low, blood insulin is low, you tend to eat something. Whenever you eat something, your blood sugar will raise, and therefore your insulin response will be triggered from this wonderful organ, which you see on the right, kind of funny looking organ called your pancreas. Now, here's the thing. When you eat a high sugar rich food, and basically sugar, carbohydrate, your blood sugar is going to spike, then it's going to go down again, then you're going to eat something again, it's going to spike. If you don't put together carbohydrate, protein, and fat, you're always going to see this nutrition roller coaster, this spike of blood sugar. Now, some people say, hey, no problem, I'll just eat. Well, yeah, you end up eating every 90 minutes to 2 hours. But here's the implication of this. Whenever your blood sugar is high, and this is, again, basic biochemistry, whenever blood sugar is high, your pancreas gets the signal to say, hey, this is a danger area. We need to secrete insulin. Insulin swoops in, does its job, decreases blood sugar, and everybody goes on their happy way. Now, the more you do this, the more you tax your pancreas to release insulin, it could, later in life, produce what's called insulin resistance, aka prediabetes or diabetes. So we don't really want that, right? We want to control our blood sugar. And as you can see from this slide, the unhappy blood sugar line is the blue line. The happy blood sugar line is the dotted red line. So we know we're going to have ebbs and flows in our blood sugar, but we don't want spikes in our blood sugar. So this is how we do it, right? We want to combine protein-rich foods. We want to combine that with fiber-rich foods, and we want to combine that with fat-rich foods. So I always say protein, fiber, fat. 75% of this game is all related to protein, fiber, and fat. Now, for you analytical, quantitative people, if you want to know the biochemistry behind what happens when insulin is actually increased because blood sugar is increased, I put it down there just to let you know, right? So insulin inhibits this thing called lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat, and this is how it does it. I'm not going to get into too much of the science, but just know that this is basic. This isn't even biochemistry 401. Like this is basic. This is biochemistry 101, right? So here's a great example: a banana. I love using bananas. Bananas are fine. It's a decent fruit. If you eat a banana by itself, your blood sugar will emulate the blue line. If you eat a banana with some type of nut butter that has protein and fat in it, now you will emulate the red dotted line. So what I'm talking about is the combination of macronutrients to control blood sugar, and that is what's so important. This is the age-old question: what do I eat, right? Well, I'm not going to tell you exactly what to eat, but I'm going to tell you how to put together your food. So when you approach food, what we're looking at is you identifying your source of protein, you identifying your source of fiber, which is carbohydrate, by the way. It's vegetables, it's fruit, it's whole grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, right? And then usually the fat is incorporated into protein-rich foods unless you are a vegan. And that while this is all still very, very possible to do with vegan and plant-based eating, it's just a little bit more tricky. You just need to be a little more concerted and make a little bit more effort towards it, but is absolutely 100% viable in terms of having a plant-based diet.
Really fascinating, Bob. And I think that piece really ties together the idea of why metabolic efficiency training. You set up the element of improving fat burning and why that might be compelling for a trail runner or ultra runner, and then the element of how to do it nutritionally, and that both the energy aspect as well as the health aspect. It creates a really compelling case. But what would you say are the top most compelling reasons for a trail runner or ultra runner to try metabolic efficiency training?
Yeah, back when I first started, this concept and created it, it was honestly, to be completely honest, it was only because I wanted to get rid of GI distress in the ultra runners that I was working with and ultra endurance athletes. That was one of their biggest concern, that and weight loss. So I was trying to just make it whatever I could, just try to change this whole GI distress monster. And I say that because I was also plagued with the GI distress monster way, late 90s, early 2000s, doing a lot of Ironman events. Even when I started getting into my ultra running career, was plagued, usually in a 100-mile race, you're talking 70, 80 miles in, and your stomach is kind of getting a little sour. So my main goal was decreasing or eliminating the risk of GI distress. And I think that's going to hit home with every single long distance trail runner. If you're doing above a 50K or above, this is going to resonate with you, right? Because a lot of ultra runners will get sour stomachs, and it's not right. Like, it's not rite of passage. It doesn't have to happen. Like, you can actually control it. And isn't it funny? Like, you don't need to take a pill. Like, all we're doing is manipulating your daily nutrition and being smart about the foods that you put in your body, and also the strategies you use for nutrition surrounding training. So that's number one. We talked about burning more fat, preserving carbohydrate, but here's another thing that's really important for trail runners is looking at body weight and body composition. So it's not, I work with a lot of triathletes too, who are pretty geeky when it comes to quantitative numbers and their body weight. Ultra running, this is why I love ultra running. Ultra running is kind of a chill sport, right? We're out there, we're having fun. We don't really care about much. We're engaging with nature. Like, it is just a total different perspective, right? But we have to go up and down mountains, and we have to go for 50, 100 miles. It benefits us to not be carrying around any extra weight. I'm not talking about like weight loss just for performance. I'm talking about health, right? If you're carrying around extra weight, in addition to probably packing your bag with 3 to maybe 8 pounds worth of water and supplies, that's really not going to be good. Not only for your mechanics and the injury rates, but also the fact that psychologically that will beat you up when you're seeing pace changes, or you're not able to make it up a hill like you used to, or whatever it is, right? So we're really talking about GI distress, changing body weight, body composition, and obviously burning more fat and preserving carbohydrate. But let's not forget about creating this healthier relationship with food. Like, metabolic efficiency training, nowhere have you seen me use the word diet. I usually try not to actually say the word diet, because diet is very short term. It's a 4-letter word that belongs with other 4-letter words, and it's not sustainable long term. Metabolic efficiency training is basically manipulating your nutrition to support your trail running volume and intensity load. And it fits into your lifestyle. Like, if you want a piece of pizza, have a piece of pizza. You want a cookie, have a cookie, right? But let's just approach it the right way. Like, let's stop being restrictive and open up this healthier relationship with food, and instead of always banging your head on the wall and saying you're a bad person because you had a cookie or whatever it is.
Very interesting, Bob. And now let's take this now a little bit further, as in the final bit of time that we have here, and talk a little bit both about the daily nutrition and how to get started with this, as well as where to get started with training nutrition. So what to do kind of on an everyday basis, and then we can give some feedback on what's worked for you, Bob, and kind of how you can fit conceptually with metabolic efficiency training when it comes to actually fueling your training. And as part of that, would love to kind of get into your rim to rim to rim run at the Grand Canyon and how you actually fueled for that. But let's, coming out of this, start with the everyday nutrition element of this. If people are trying to plan their everyday nutrition patterns in a style that is in alignment with metabolic efficiency training, you've created a model that kind of makes this very easy to get started. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And let me start by just saying simple is sustainable, right? So don't count calories, don't count grams. Like, you don't need to do this. Like, life is too short. Like, go out and enjoy the trails, right? Don't worry about all these calories and stuff. So what I've created is what I call the hand model, or CHO is carbohydrate, PRO is protein, could also be called the carbohydrate to protein ratio, right? So here's basically what it is. The carbohydrate to protein ratio, or hand model, is if you look at one of your hands, and that's measured from your wrist to your fingertips, that is one hand size, right? So when we're looking at the classification of blood sugar, and that's what that second row is, the classification of controlling blood sugar, we want to be in the green. right? That is optimizing blood sugar. It's teaching our body to burn more fat. It's controlling not only blood sugar, but also insulin levels. That's where we want to be in the green, right? Yellow is kind of okay. And then red, yeah, we don't really want to be there too much, right? So what we're trying to do, and I give you a little bit of application here, but it really is as easy as this. You choose the volume of one hand to be protein. You choose the volume of the other hand to be carbohydrate, aka fiber, right? If you put those together in a meal, you're not going to go wrong. That's the 1-to-1 ratio, and that's going to be an ideal blood sugar response. So it can be a piece of chicken and some broccoli. It can, I mean, you can make it whatever you want. It's real food, right? So sometimes we may need more carbohydrate depending on the duration and intensity of which we're training. And that is why it's still okay to go up to 2-to-1. And that 2 is 2 handfuls of carbohydrate and 1 handful of protein. That will still maintain very good blood sugar control, but you don't want to use this too often, especially if you have had GI distress or if you have some body weight and body composition goals. Most of the time, I try to get my ultra runners sticking around 1-to-1 and save the 2-to-1 for really long training days. Like if you're going to go out and just, have a weekend about it, right? Those might be good 2-to-1 days versus 1-to-1 days. So it really is as easy as just looking at food relative to the volume you have. The hand model is actually, there's a lot of science behind that I won't introduce now, but it's really looking at how do we put food together in the right quantities now. And that's why carbohydrate and protein, as an aside, have the same calories per gram. That's why we can get away with comparing a 1 part ratio to 1 part ratio. So in the end, 1 handful of protein, which also has fat in it, 1 handful of carbohydrate, preferably not refined, not processed. We're talking about fruits, veggies, whole grains. Putting those together in a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 ratio will optimize blood sugar and improve your metabolic efficiency.
And to kind of help people with that, this is kind of another foodless chart that can make that whole pairing of foods very easy, right? So how should people kind of think about using something like this?
Yeah, I like to include this just to say, most of your daily nutrition should come in the red box if you can help it. Like 90%, you can satisfy all your needs through the first 2 columns. And then obviously whole grains, yes, and then misses. So misses are foods that aren't necessarily a protein, fat, vegetable, or fruit, or whole grain. So this could be things like chocolate, things like chips, donuts, cookies, whatever, right? They just don't fit in another category. It's very important to have misses because that again is the healthy relationship with food, but not to maximize the misses. Instead, we want to minimize the misses. So this is actually a really good little slide that you can just, and what I have ultra runners do all the time is they list the foods that they enjoy, right? The protein and fat that they like. Maybe it's chicken and peanut butter and other beans or nuts or whatever. And you just list what you like in each category and eat from the left to the right. And that's why those arrows are pointing from the left to the right. When you build meals and snacks, identify your protein food first, then add some color with a vegetable and or fruit. And then if you still need some extra carbohydrates, choose some whole grains. And then every so often, the occasional miss, you can have that. Absolutely. Like allow yourself to do it. So this is a great way to just quantify the foods that you like in different categories. It becomes a great shopping list and becomes a good meal idea list because really you're just pairing foods together, protein, fat, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and the occasional miss.
And Bob, for a lot of athletes, I mean, for things that you find commonly, people love to eat eggs, cheese, if you're a meat eater, bacon, a burger, like you were saying before, this doesn't have to be restrictive in any way. I mean, people are doing this and feeling very satiated, feeling like they're eating delicious food. It's just kind of having the wherewithal and the knowledge to know how to structure those meals.
Exactly. And I think the biggest mistake ultra runners make is they think they need more carbohydrates in their daily nutrition than they really do. And I think the other thing is, a lot of times ultra runners, we're used to eating solid food. So we're eating a lot of these foods, but they're not eating it at the right time. So they are maybe pushing that envelope in terms of not optimizing blood sugar. So, maybe they're just, before their run, they're going to have a banana, or they're having a snack as an apple at work or something. And so they're eating what we refer to as nutritious foods, but the timing, and more importantly, the pairing of the foods is a little bit off. And those are the two biggest mistakes I see a lot of ultra runners make.
In the little bit of time we have left, Bob, I just wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about the training aspect of it. How does
Mhm.
metabolic efficiency work when you're actually out there running and you've got to fuel these long runs, and even get some feedback from you on kind of what you did yourself when you were just out there in the Grand Canyon a few months ago. And as part of this, we're going to talk about UCAN. So folks that may not be familiar with UCAN on this webinar today, what's really fascinating about UCAN is that it's an energy product, a sports nutrition product that's very compatible with metabolic efficiency. And UCAN is a carbohydrate-based product, but it's a really unique carbohydrate that we call superstarch that breaks down very slowly and steadily. And it's essentially a carbohydrate that maintains a steady level of blood sugar without a big spike for a long period of time. Right there, if we think back about Bob talking about, some of the principles behind metabolic efficiency and how important blood sugar control was as a key pillar of metabolic efficiency, at the core of it, that's what UCAN does as a product. So just as a quick backstory, the superstarch that I was talking about was originally developed for a rare metabolic disorder for one of our founders' sons, where these kids basically couldn't maintain their energy levels. So they needed an energy source, a carbohydrate source that could break down very slowly over a long period of time and sustain their blood sugar. So this is where the superstarch was originally developed for these kids to take prior to sleeping at night, and basically maintain this steady level of energy for up to 8 hours so they could sleep throughout the night. Now, it's kind of the same thing that an endurance athlete wants, that same sustained, long-lasting energy without the highs and lows. And it's also really what we're talking about when we're talking about metabolic efficiency, that idea of being able to control blood sugar and not riding that blood sugar roller coaster that Bob talked about. So conceptually, UCAN and metabolic efficiency make a lot of sense together, and they go hand in hand. Bob, how do you view the relationship kind of between UCAN and metabolic efficiency, and why do you feel that it's such a sensible fuel source for this type of nutrition strategy?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, let me digress a little bit. When I did my first 100 as Leadville in 2005, really before UCAN was really out, right? For the most part, there's no option. Here's the thing with ultra runners: we eat solid food, right? Unfortunately, we don't process it well enough, right? So in some people have iron stomachs and iron guts, and some people don't. I am unfortunate not to have an iron stomach, but I always got a lot of GI distress. I taught myself, like after my Ironman days, I tried to teach myself as I went into the ultra running world and doing a lot of hundreds, was try to teach myself, okay, I have to eat real food because that's what's going to be on the course. I have to sustain myself. And, I found that over time, I was able to try to eat real food before going out on some of my long runs. But my stomach just didn't feel right, and I tell you what, I won't tell you exactly what I was eating, but let's just say it was highly processed. It was highly refined because I wanted it to digest very quickly, because I didn't want it to cause any upset in my stomach. So fast forward when UCAN was actually developed, and I tell you what, it makes life so much easier, especially for those of us who are plagued with the GI distress monster, or for those of us just want to simplify. Like, here's the thing. I don't want to be carrying. I remember my first Leadville, and you'd laugh at this. I had my crew, I had my pacers, and I packed the back of my car. I had 3 boxes of food, and I had my A box, my B box, my C box. And remember, again, this was way before Generation UCAN was not way before, but right before they were out and really came to market. My A box was, all right, everything is going to go well with my stomach, and this is what I'm going to eat. My B box was, well, maybe things go a little bit south. My C box was, do anything I can to get to the finish line, right? So that was things like Skittles and Red Vines and just crap, right? My A box was the food that I was training with. Now, I will tell you that I had a combination of all 3 boxes, and the stomach was not happy during my first 100. And unfortunately, like I said, at that time, we only had either real food and or a lot of simple sugar-based products. So let's fast forward to Generation UCAN coming on the scene and what it does. I mean, I can't tell you how much this has not only changed my life in terms of being an ultra runner and an endurance athlete, but the hundreds upon hundreds of endurance athletes I work with as a dietitian, as a sport dietitian, completely changes their outlook, because all of a sudden you have a fuel that, number one, doesn't cause GI distress because it empties from the stomach very quickly. It also provides longer lasting energy. So you're not seeing that quick, simple sugar spike while you're running or hiking up the mountain. And it's actually sustainable throughout a longer endurance event, throughout a longer race, a 50K, 50 mile, 100 miles. So you're getting the best of all three worlds with one product, which is great. And this is why I wanted to put it to the test with my Grand Canyon experiment last fall. But does that kind of answer your question, or kind of go into the Generation UCAN story?
Absolutely, Bob. And I think you kind of just laid it right. Like, I mean, the things that you were laying out that are compelling and trail runners and ultra runners care about, it's like, can I get through this without my stomach being all over the place? Can I not ride this blood sugar roller coaster? And can I minimize how much I actually have to physically carry out there with me, you know? And I think what you just kind of summarized, you can really be a contributing factor in a positive way for all three of those kind of key core elements that Bob had outlined. So for you, Bob, going into the rim to rim to rim, tell us a little bit about what you were actually undertaking, and then your nutrition strategy, and how you fuel.
Yeah, so it was, I decided this last summer. I did a Spartan race, and I also do obstacle course racing. And the first one I did the Ultra Spartan, so it's a 31 mile and this was in Colorado. So we were going up and down a mountain a couple times, and trail running. So I had a great base. I had some strength, obviously, but I decided with about 8 weeks, after the Spartan Ultra race, to just go down to the Grand Canyon. I always wanted to do this, the rim to rim to rim, run it solo, just to do it, right? It's just kind of one of those things. It's a beautiful, obviously beautiful location. And just for me, not only is it beautiful, bucket list, that kind of thing, but I wanted to kind of challenge a nutrition strategy. And that's what I came into. So, my fitness level was decent, did a lot of longer runs, never got above 22 miles. For me, it just, my body just doesn't handle recovery well after that. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to do the entire rim to rim to rim. Now, for those of you who are familiar with it, you know what I'm talking about. For those of you who don't, there are basically two routes you can take. One route is a little bit longer, one route is a little bit shorter. Of course, I took the longer route, about 46 miles, give or take, because GPS is not that accurate in the canyon. What I wanted to do was I wanted to not only prove to myself, which I already knew it was true because I've tested this before, just not to this extent, but I wanted to prove to other ultra runners that you can actually go into an event or a competition or whatever you want to call it. Now, this wasn't a competition. I just did it solo. I was having fun. I wanted to prove to everyone that you don't have to overthink your training or race day, competition day nutrition. Like, you don't have to, like I used to do in the past in Ironman days. You set, here's the calories and here's this and here are the gels and the bars and all this stuff. Like, I just wanted to be simple, right? So I wanted to prove, simple is sustainable, not only in daily nutrition, but also in training nutrition. So it's funny because all I brought with me in my pack, like I had a Camelback, I had 2 liters of water, which I had Generation UCAN watermelon hydrate, which we haven't really talked about a lot, but that's the electrolyte powder that UCAN provides. So I had some electrolyte in my Camelback. I knew I had water stops along the way, at least on the south rim part. They closed the north rim because I did this on Halloween. And I literally took with me this is it. I took 2 pouches of Generation UCAN chocolate protein packets, just 2 of those. And then I took UCAN bars. And I only took 8 of them, and I ended up eating 7 of them. But let me just, that's it. Like, think about, and I don't know if you're thinking about this, right? there's no support along the way. You have water at certain points. You're out there alone. I had no crew. I had no pacers. And actually that time of the year, I hardly saw anybody on the trail, which was kind of weird. I started at 3:30 in the morning, and it took me 13 and a half hours to finish this, going south rim to north rim, back to south rim. But there's no support. So let's grasp this concept. Whatever I was carrying on my back, that's all I had the entire day, unless I tried to bum something off of anyone that I could potentially see, or if I wanted to, make a stop at Phantom Ranch, which is the base of the canyon by the Colorado River, and hit somebody up for some calories. But I wanted to basically say, I am carrying all my nutrition. Every single piece of my nutrition was UCAN based, except for water and except for my 3 pieces of gum, which I love running with. That's just part of my routine, right? And sugarless gum, by the way. So what ended up happening was I basically went on feel. When I was hungry, I would have a UCAN bar. So I ended up having 7 UCAN bars and 2 UCAN chocolate protein packets for 13 and a half hours. I've already done the math for you guys, right? That's 118 calories per hour with over 20,000 feet of vertical gain. Took me 13 and a half hours to do. So if you can just wrap your head around that, it was probably the most simple event that I've ever done in my life, because at no point was I worrying about my nutrition. I was worrying more about physical fatigue, my footing, especially when it was dark and I was running with my headlamp. And that's it. Like, I didn't have to worry about anything. And to come out of that doing the rim to rim to rim on 118 calories per hour, I think that's going to blow a lot of people's minds.
It's remarkable, Bob, because I think I want to just kind of drill this point home again after you said that, but you said you were fit, but your longest run up to that point, was 22 miles. So you were fit, but you were kind of not doing crazy training. And then as you took us through from the nutrition side of things, you weren't doing any kind of crazy starvation diet. You were just plotting your nutrition, perhaps in the months leading up to it, or maybe you've been doing this for so long in a very sensible way, following this metabolic efficiency model where the way you're eating was optimizing how efficient you were, and then you were able to use a training fuel that kind of supported that. So I think it's all very fascinating, and it's super fascinating to me, because when you kind of hear some of those amazing outputs, like, oh man, you did that whole thing on 13 hours, 120 calories or 118 calories per hour, the initial thought might be like, oh yeah, but you must have done some crazy stuff in the months leading up to it, to get yourself to that place. But that's not the case at all.
No, not at all. And, to put it in perspective too, like my long run days, I was talking about that carbohydrate to protein ratio hand model. On my long run days, I would eat 2 to 1, so a little bit more carbohydrate to protein. On all other days, I was 1 to 1. I allowed misses. I'm a chocoholic. I love chocolate. I like pizza. Like, you allow that, but you build it in. And more importantly, the only days that in every long run, I took UCAN products. Because I was trying the bars, I was trying the protein, the chocolate protein, but I only did that once a week on my long runs. All of my other runs, I actually only did on UCAN hydrate, which is the electrolyte, with water, because I simply didn't need the calories. Because remember, again, I was going for 3 hours on these shorter runs, and I didn't need any calories because I was developing such a high degree of metabolic efficiency. It was only those really long runs that I actually needed those calories.
And just for folks that might not be familiar, so with the UCAN bars and the UCAN protein that Bob's alluding to, these both have the super starch in them. So that the carbohydrate that we were talking about, the super starch, which is the energy source in UCAN, the slow releasing carbohydrate, that's the foundation of both the UCAN powders with or without protein, as well as the UCAN bars. So when Bob talks about fueling with those and being able to maintain his energy, he's really talking about what the super starch is able to offer in terms of that slow and steady release and that ability to maintain your blood sugar instead of that kind of traditional quick sugar spike that you get from a lot of the traditional sports fuels out there. Bob, really insightful. I wanted to leave you perhaps with just one last question before we sign off for the day, which is, how do you suggest people get started? If people are listening to this, if people are intrigued, I'm going to share some additional resources that you've developed with folks before we get out of here. But how do people who are fascinated by this even go about jumping into this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of great resources that I have available. I think really the easiest way to bring it back to kind of, to home, so to speak, is look at what I presented here with the carbohydrate to protein ratio or the hand model. Look at that food list, the columns that you're seeing on your screen right now. If you can start making lists of the food that you enjoy eating, and then starting to put together the 1-to-1 ratio of carbohydrate to protein, that is, I mean, no joke, the easiest place to start, because you don't need a lot of fancy foods. You don't need to, you don't need to follow programs. What you need to do is start figuring out what foods you enjoy that are in the specific protein, fat, carbohydrate, categories. Then start putting them together in the correct volume. To be honest with you, from a daily nutrition perspective, that's all you need to start doing. Like it really is a lot simpler than I believe you think it is. From a training nutrition strategy, once you get into your longer runs, honestly, I'm going to say this, like, don't bother with any simple sugar products. Like, that is simply not necessary for ultra runners. And that's why I think it's such, like, metabolic efficiency training and Generation UCAN, no brainer when it comes to matching those for ultra runners. I mean, it is just, again, I alluded to this earlier, but it is a match made in heaven, because we need slower burning energy, which we get through Generation UCAN products. And on the daily nutrition side, we need to develop putting simple foods together to elucidate a better blood sugar response. I mean, that is really the foundation of this whole thing.
Well, that's a terrific place to kind of wrap up, and I think keeping those final points you made, Bob, it top of mind is really illuminating and important. I just wanted to share a few resources with folks before we sign off. So Bob's written some incredible books, both recipe books as well as just the conceptual metabolic efficiency training book, which you can get them all online at energyperformance.com. So if you would really like to dive deeper into some of the theory behind this, or even are somebody that just needs some recipe inspiration to get started, then Bob can definitely help you out with some of these resources. Bob, anything else you wanted to add about this? What else can people kind of look for to dive deeper into this?
Yeah, the energy performance for sure. We have a plant-based metabolic efficiency recipe book too. So for our vegans and our plant-based athletes out there, this past year, a colleague of mine actually created a new company called Baroda Foods. And what you see on the right here is we've actually created cocoa and creamer products that are completely metabolically efficient. So the functional ingredients we put in there, there are no sugars added, but the functional ingredients actually work together to improve blood sugar levels, to actually increase ketone levels, which we haven't talked about, but basically it's a byproduct of fat metabolism. So all of these Baroda Food, cocoa, and creamer products, which are great on their own or add to coffee or put in different recipes or smoothies, those will actually enhance your daily nutrition ability to become more metabolically efficient. So now you actually have some decent cocoa and creamer products on the market. They're powders. You can travel with them that will actually enhance your metabolic efficiency instead of detracting from it.
Wonderful. Well, Bob, thanks so much for the insight. And hopefully everybody here can see today that, with some strategic knowledge, pairing foods together, and then making some smart choices around training with some products, this is something that can really be achieved without too much complication, without a lot of restriction, and, frankly, by eating lots and lots of real whole foods. So, Bob, I just really want to thank you again. You're a wealth of knowledge. Love kind of hearing you put this stuff into action yourself, and really appreciate your willingness to share your own personal experience with us. So just want to thank you so much for your time, and thank everyone who tuned in for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. And thank you guys for listening.
Awesome. You can check Bob out at energyperformance.com. He's also on all of your social networks, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Bob Seebohar. Check out UCAN at Gen UCAN and at generationyoucan.com. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you next time.